welcome on Speak Your Mind. I'm your host, Shami Lochanlal, and with me I have my guest, Director for Human Rights, Ashwin Raj. Welcome on Speak Your Mind, Ashwin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Shami, and good afternoon, Fiji.
Ashwin, recently, let's start. Let's come to the point. Recently, you have been under target, and people have been asking for you to resign. You have been getting a lot of personal threats too, because you have been advocating on the fact that Facebook should be shut down. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I'm not. What I have actually said is that people have the constitutional right to be free from hate speech. So if you look at Section 17 of the Constitution, Section 17, subsection 4, it explicitly provides that we have the right to be free from hate speech, and it defines hate speech as any expression that encourages or has the effect of encouraging discrimination based on a prohibited ground. Now, people might ask, what is a prohibited ground of discrimination? So if you look at Section 26 of the Constitution, Section 26 says that one must not be unfairly discriminated against because of one's actual or supposed personal characteristics. And it makes reference to a number of things that I think the audience should know. And these include references to race, ethnicity, culture, social origin, color, the place of origin, sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, your primary language, your economic, social or health status, your disability, age, religion, conscience, even marital status and pregnancy. So when you look at prohibited grounds of discrimination, it's quite an inclusive, expansive area.
I think it's important that people should know, why is hate speech in the Bill of Rights?
So I think this is a fundamental question that we need to sort of recognize, that as much as the Constitution under Section 17 provides that everybody has the right to freedom of expression, thought, publication, etc., it also puts justifiable limitations in place so that, and that also includes the freedom to be, the right to be free from hate speeches. And there's a reason why it's been done. Because no set of rights or freedoms come unfettered. It comes with responsibility. And what we've actually witnessed, and not just in Fiji, globally, there's a surge in hate speeches. So people are writing the most incriminatory stuff based on, and attacks are based on one's religion, or one's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and Fiji is no exception. Of course, what's different for us is the fact that as much as people write these things in the social media, and it's not just Facebook, you're looking at all kinds of social media platforms, it actually is an assault on human dignity. In fact, people have said that when, Mr. Raj has been calling for a regulation of the social media, it's going to produce a chilling effect on freedom of expression. Well, Shami, the reality is, and people in Fiji should know that racism, institutionalized racism, and discriminated on any other prohibited grounds of discrimination, in fact has a chilling effect on people's ability to freely express themselves. You know, and everybody in Fiji knows, so let's not pretend that we've had a history of institutionalized racism. This is a country which has had a lot of, violence, both physical and psychological, in relation to institutionalized racism. How do you think when communities are under threat, when individuals are under threat, they can speak their mind? So I find it ironic that today, when we stood up against hate speeches and other forms of discrimination, you have people on the other side of the political divide who are saying we are throttling freedom of expression.
Because if you look at 1987 coup and the 2000 coup was incited that Indo-Fijians were the common enemy trying to take our land, right? So that was hate speech. And now there's some political parties, for their gain, are trying to portray a multicultural face where they're saying that we want all inclusive. So this time they're not targeting Indo-Fijian, but they are targeting a minority community, which is the Muslim community. And because the Attorney General is a Muslim, they are targeting him as a Muslim. Because they can't target Indo-Fijians, right? And as you mentioned earlier, that some political parties or NFP leader, Professor Biman Prasad, suggested on April 2nd in a press release that because you have been trying to be very vocal and proactive on putting on saying that social media should be regulated and people should be taken to task. And he's saying that we are trying to control people's freedom of expression. What is your say on that?
This is a very, very politically convenient argument. I mean, it's just mired in that sense of idealism where they're trying to, frame and privilege the idea of freedom of expression almost as if it doesn't come with any justifiable limitations. What's actually happening in Fiji with the limitations imposed under Section 17 of the Constitution, which guarantees freedom of expression, thought, opinion, publication, so on and so forth, and the attendant justifiable limitations that come with it that call for responsibility on the grounds of national security, public order, public morality, the freedom to be, the right to be free from hate speeches and so on and so forth, actually is an international law. So if you look at Article 19 of the ICCPR, it's an international law. I know people have been making a lot of noise about how we haven't ratified the covenant on civil and political rights. But if you look at our constitution, the Bill of Rights actually encompasses the most salient features of the convention. So why is it that Fiji is being made a state of exception? These rules apply globally. Now, the other thing is, ever since I've kind of picked up this fight against hate speeches, and particularly so when I gave my address at the Honorable Attorney General's conference, the leader of SADELPA has asked for my resignation. Then a fellow SADELPA member called for my resignation. Then people started writing hate mails to me personally. Now there's a campaign, I understand, online which is calling for my resignation. Well, you may be able to shut me down and threaten me and all of that, but you can't change the fact that there's international law in place. Most constitutional jurisdictions are thinking and talking about the deleterious impact of hate speeches on our ability to exercise democracy. Democracy is built on reason, not on fear and threats. So in a fundamental sense, I mean, we need to contextualize what's happening in Fiji with the global jurisprudence on freedom of expression.
And also, we'll take a break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the reason that some people or political parties are opposing to the fact that they shouldn't be banned on social media. Is it for their personal gains? Writing on FBC, same as writing in newspaper, TV news, it's for public consumption, and the damage it does when it comes to defaming a character.
Absolutely.
And we've also seen that there are some very significant or very common people, one or two who have been writing on social media pages. So we're going to discuss this very important fact after this segment. You're free to call and join the discussion on 3220-906 and 3220-907 on Gold FM's Speak Your Mind. This is Speak Your Mind, live on Gold FM and later to be viewed on FBC TV tonight after 10 p.m. news. You can also watch this talkback show tomorrow at 11 a.m. on FBC TV and at 1 p.m. on FBC TV Plus. My guest is the Director for Human Rights, Ashwin Raj. Ashwin, earlier we were talking about inciting hate speech, and there are certain groups of people, right? There's some people who may not believe what is written there, but then there are people who will believe. These are very gullible people. So hate speech containing racial comments, which is the case in Fiji, and posts that are inciting religious hatred on social media is becoming a concern. What could be consequences if not controlled? Because if you do relate to 87 and 2000 coup, people paid a huge price for this.
This is a wonderful question, and I think this is the kind of question that Fiji should be asking. What is the cost of hate speech? As I've said so many times before, hate speech is an anathema to democracy. It is an assault on human dignity. It diminishes the sense of dignity that people have. It makes them less of a human. Now, what happens when you start trash-talking people, when you reduce them to their race, their religion, their ethnicity, and then belittle them? Basically, the ability to then descend that into overt physical violence is that easy because you've dehumanized the person. So let me tell the audience what it is that perturbs us. What do we mean by hate speech? Just before I came to your studio, I thought, look, willful suspension of disbelief, let me go have a look at some of the sites again. Is it incriminatory? So there's an image of a person of Islamic faith who's doing the prayers, and they've decided to insert on one of the anti-government block sites, they've decided to insert a goat, almost depicting as if the goat is engaged in a sexual act with the person who's praying. Now you tell me, and can Mr. Rambuka, Mr. Biman Prasad, all of these people justify that that is freedom of expression? Why is that freedom of expression, and how is that an exercise in democracy? These are the people who said, look, this government is paranoid, it is afraid of criticism, and this is why they're shutting down, mainstream media. They've put a draconian media industry development act, and now they are taking to the last bastion of freedom, which is the social media. Now, can any of these people tell me, when you look at that image, when you look at constant attack on Muslims, and not just on Muslims, they also talk about, inciting Hindus against Muslims, and then there's this other division amongst North Indians and South Indians, right? You look at the way people talk about Gujaratis, right? You look at the way people talk about Itoke communities, right? Not all Itokes are racist, as much as not all Indo-Fijians are racist. But the stereotypes that they propagate, because it's politically convenient. Look, people like a house divided. It works for them. So am I alone in calling for an end to hate speeches, and that, the freedom of expression argument cannot be used in an alibi to justify hate speeches? You look at what the UN Human Rights Commissioner said early this year, to mark the celebration of the elimination of racial discrimination. Now he says, and I quote, and I want everybody in Fiji to hear this out: states have no excuse for allowing racism and xenophobia to fester, much less flourish. They have the legal obligation to prohibit and eliminate racial discrimination, to guarantee the right to everyone, no matter their race, color, national or ethnic origin, to equality before law. States should adopt legislation expressly prohibiting racist hate speech, including the dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or hatred, incitement to racial discrimination, and threats of incitement to violence. It is not an attack on free speech or the silencing of controversial ideas or criticism, but a recognition that the right to freedom of expression carries with it special duties and responsibilities. Now you tell me, is Mr. Rambuka, is Mr. Biman Prasad, or the couple of hundred people who have now started this social media campaign to have me resign will ask the UN Human Rights Commissioner to resign too, because he's also in cahoots with the Honorable Qayyum and the Honorable Prime Minister? What is the UN High Commissioner also working for the Attorney General and the Prime Minister
what
of
we're
Fiji?
Trying to say is that it's like a political gain. Like I mentioned earlier, in 87 and 2000, it was targeting Indo-Fijians because which was their tool, right? And now a minority community, a Muslim community, has become the target. And because AG is a Muslim, they are targeting him as a Muslim. They can't target him as Indo-Fijian. So they're trying to create that fear and coming up with anti-Muslim stories. While you're talking about some social media posts, I had a look at some posts before coming on the show in preparation towards this. There are a Sodalpa candidate, Pastor Ezekiel's Facebook post has called the Prime Minister as Muhammad Bainimarama in order to target AG and Fiji first. They're using religion. After this matter was reported, the same kind of post was posted again. The intention is negative things about Fiji Fest. How long can this go on for?
Well, Shami, there are several things, which I find very, very peculiar about that. As you know, I've lodged an official complaint with the police. I think is going to set an important precedent if this person's actually charged. But it needs to be done by the independent, institutions of the police and the DPP. But one thing that's significant is we need to see who are the people who are posting these things. And as I said in my letter of complaint, pursuant to Section 65, subsection 2A and B of the Crimes Act, these posts have the effect of, inciting communal antagonism, and ill will based on religion and so on and so forth. And the reason why I said we must look at this thing very, very seriously is because, one, the state has a legal obligation to protect its citizens against hate speeches. Right? That's why it's in the Constitution. That's why it's in the Bill of Rights. It is a human rights issue. Now, people are calling for my resignation, says this guy needs to focus on human rights work. Why he's actually sitting there. May I just humbly remind everybody, this is human rights work.
Human rights, yes.
And this is anti-discrimination work.
My concern
now, the other thing is this, Shami.
Yes.
Look at the standing of these people. This person is a pastor, he's a religious leader, he's also a candidate of a major political party. So imagine the influence they actually have on ordinary citizens. Now, very, very interesting that it operates at various levels. You look at the post, it actually makes reference to the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Yes.
It talks about the Honorable Attorney General as the chief and king of all people in Fiji. Now, of course, there's a subtle racial undertone to the whole thing.
Yes.
Very, very conveniently, everybody forgets that the Honorable Attorney General actually married an Itoke.
Yes.
And nobody wants to talk about that. So the attack really is about how he is actually leading Fiji and destroying all of the indigenous institutions. Somebody wrote to me and said, what we're witnessing is a cultural genocide. And I said, that is a very serious term. Can you please substantiate your claim? Nothing came after that. So I think we need to look deeper in terms of who these people are, what it is that they're doing,
their standing,
and what is their standing, what is their
concern,
what is their beef.
Comes from a pastor, because we look up to people, religious leaders, like a pastor, people who come from that believe posting comments like racial comments, because Bible does not teach about that.
No, absolutely.
And no religious books teaches about that. So what kind of people are you putting your trust and faith into when it comes to casting your vote? We're going to take a break, Ashwin, and we're going to talk about other comments on Facebook, because it's time to highlight these posts, because they are not only people here in Fiji, but there are people overseas. And I'm sure that public at large or listeners would want to know what these comments are. It's time to open our eyes. It's time to start thinking and thinking with our brains, and not be led by silly comments on Facebook with people who are posting it with such low mentality. And
have the courage of conviction to stand up to it.
Exactly. So we'll take a break and then we'll come back. Meanwhile, you can call us and join this discussion on 3220906 and 3220907 on Gold FM. Speak Your Mind. This is Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, and I'm your host, Shami Lochanlal. My guest is Ashwin Raj, the Human Rights Director. Ashwin, we are talking about social media, Facebook, and to the extent to which it has been abused, trying to incite a lot of jealousy, hatred, which could lead to some damaging consequences, which was faced by Fiji in 1987. In 2000, ladies were raped. Shops and houses were set to fire. A lot of people fled. There was so much fear. We don't want a repeat of that. Now, let's look at some more posts. What happens to people like Shailen Raju, Rajendra Chaudhary, the son of a political leader, Mahendra Chaudhary? These people are writing from overseas to create a situation where people will start hating Muslims to influence people and not to support. What do we do? What does law say about this?
Shami, several things we need to sort of kind of point out here before we even go to the law is establishing the facts. Now, remember, several months ago, the Honorable Biman Prasad had issued a statement saying that all of these things around hate speeches are my own concoctions. Now, people can read for themselves. People are not stupid. They're not that oblivious that some of these political leaders, make it out to be. People can read for themselves and they can see what hate speech is. So first of all, these are not my concoctions.
It's obvious.
I have to be very industrious to go out and produce as much material as there is, because the social media is saturated with this stuff. That's the first thing. The second thing is, why does our Constitution talk about this stuff? It's because of our history. We are emerging out of the detritus of institutionalized racism. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights has very, very strong and salutary provisions, and including the idea that we all be called Fijians precisely because it's a response to a particular historical political conjuncture. The idea that we must erase the ignominy of racism from our public memory. And what this stuff does in terms of what we see in the social media is a sad indictment of the fact that we have yet to decolonize our imagination from the vicissitudes of racism and communalism. So if you look at the way in which we are conflagrating, communalism is pretty scary stuff. And so they're targeting sort of communities that happen to be individuals that happen to be of a particular faith-based sort of collectivity, or coming from a particular sort of kind of ethnic, religious background. No, these people didn't elect to be in that. We were born into certain communities. So to then vilify an entire collectivity and reduce them to that is problematic. So if you look at the Honorable Prime Minister, right, he's not just an Itoke. He's also a Christian. He's a Catholic. He's a father. He's a grandfather. He's a prime minister. So what happens is, if you look at all of those multiple identities, people reduce it and they flatten it to this one thing because it becomes politically convenient. So the systematic targeting of people for any of these prohibited ground of discrimination, which is their ethnicity, their religion, and so on and so forth, is what we are talking about. We are not talking about quelling dissenting voices. You look at the Crimes Act. If you look at the charge of sedition under Section 66, nowhere does it say that just because you're being critical of government, right, you're going to be charged with sedition. I know that there's some talk now that, this archaic law of sedition needs to go, blah, blah. Let's not confuse it with hate speeches. And you have every right to be critical. If you think that water supply is not working, if you think government policies need to change, if you think that, the health sector is not delivering, speak your mind. That is your democratic right. But it must be done through lawful means, legitimate means. How can you achieve, right, the goal of expressing your disenchantment over certain policies and procedures by swearing at somebody's mother or religion and so on and so forth? What can you actually achieve?
Too low. So the handful of people, like I mentioned earlier, there are few names which we normally see, and these are people from overseas, Chilean and
we all know who they are. This is the crazy thing.
It's nothing to hide.
We know who they are.
We know
and
who
what
they
I
are.
find crazy is the fact that they are linked to political leaders in this country
So it's
who
like
don't want to
more
call
of a
them out.
political motivation you're trying to say?
Why is it that some of these leaders, right, who are the relics of our political past, right? These are their children, right? These are their children. These are their political supporters. Why aren't these leaders coming out and telling their children and their relatives and their supporters to stop the hate speech? And yet at the same time, there's this whole veneer of multiculturalism talk.
So can something be done to stop writers like Shilen Chaudhary?
No. So hang on. I think Fiji needs to realize this. Fiji needs to realize the fact that these leaders, right, as they purport to be the engineers of multicultural Fiji and unity and inclusion, because the campaign is going on for elections, people need to pause and ask, but hold on a second. You're saying and you're espousing to these values of multiculturalism and unity and all of that stuff. Why aren't you stopping your children and your political party supporters from inciting hate speech? If you truly believe in that stuff, why don't you clean your own backyard first? Or the leader of this particular political party, who after Ambassador Nazir Shamim Khan, when she spoke in Geneva, and the chain of racist hate speeches that came with it, and religious vilification and so on and so forth, quickly decided to erase stuff from their political party website. Why don't you own up, confront, and clean your own backyard first before you unabashedly lampoon the notion of freedom of expression? We catch them in the act each time. And the people of Fiji, once again, I want to say, are not stupid. They're not oblivious. They can see it. What really troubles me is the indifference, because people think it's not my drama. I'm going to go deal with something else. I'm just going to engage in it because we're all quite bored. I'm going to put in a comment or two, right? But the point is, we need to have the courage of conviction to stand up and call it out for what it is. And I'm telling you, this is only going to intensify. As we get closer to elections, campaign. These are desperate times. The only goal is to get into parliament by hook or by crook. So if it means vilifying communities and individuals, we're going to do it. Now, who pays the price in all of this? It's the ordinary poor. I'm glad you talked about 87 and 2000 and all of that. Whose houses got burned? Who were forcibly removed from their property? How many people committed suicide because their land leases were not renewed and all of that? The destitution, the sexual violence and all of that. These are people that don't have even electricity in their homes, let alone having the luxury of having a laptop to write, what they don't like about the current government. So here's a whole bunch of people who come from upwardly class mobile stratum society, rich, privileged, powerful, who sit on their laptops whole day, presumably they don't have a job, and they vilify people. And they love watching a good show. Now, you look at this campaign that is online right now to have me removed, some of the people there are foreigners. These foreigners are absolutely unhappy that under our current constitution, they can't come and buy land the way they used to. Right? So what they've done, they've joined the campaign as well and calling for my resignation because I haven't fought for their cause.
People have got their personal agenda.
This is personal agenda. This is self-aggrandizement. So a whole bunch of politically desperate, irrelevant people coming together, right? Coming together because this is a very, very convenient platform from which to push.
Definitely. Because it's just like using a newspaper because it's for public consumption. So would people write such comments in a newspaper? Would they come on a television and,
they
write
try.
their things?
We have a matter before the courts where, absolutely vilificatory stuff was on the mainstream media. So social media then becomes, it's interesting that they called it the last bastion of freedom. Freedom to do what?
Freedom to maybe to cause more damage, and we discussed about political gains.
Like I said, they like the house divided. Yeah. When Fiji is burning, it's the time to capitalize.
There you go. Very strong statement. And we discussed some very important things in this segment for people to think and ponder what kind of Fiji they want. Would they trust a post on social media for some selfish people, for the political gains? They're trying to incite fear, sitting in overseas countries trying to watch a show and, all drama. We'll take a break. And Ashwin, when we come back, we'd like to talk about what should be my responsibility, what should be people's responsibility, what can we do to stand against this and become a voice against this thing, to have an inclusive and a healthy Fiji. So soon after this break, do join us. Welcome back on Speak Your Mind. My guest is the Director for Human Rights Commission, Ashwin Raj. Ashwin, we have seen that there are all kinds of people with some kind of mental attitude who are trying to cause this damage. So, and there are a lot of gullible people, people who get emotionally carried away. What should be our responsibility as concerned and responsible citizens of Fiji?
Shami, first of all, because there's such a hue and cry about democracy and the state of our democracy, and some are contesting and saying we don't have democracy, so on and so forth, all of them have lost sight of the fact that democracy is something which is built on reason, right? That's why we call it deliberative democracy. So you engage with reason. There's no reason in racism. There's no reason in hate. There's no reason in prejudice. There's no reason in discrimination, right? So this is the first thing that they should, think about. People who are unabashedly lampooning the idea of democracy and deep democracy as the ideal political form need to realize that democracy is built on reason. And people who are propagating hate speech are not doing it based on reason. Reason would mean that you and I disagree, and we enter each other's protocol and we thresh it out based on ideas. Fiji doesn't do that. The people in Fiji don't do that. We still discuss people. We don't discuss ideas. We discuss people. And we thresh them out for their personal identity. Now, that's the first thing. So how do we engage? The biggest challenge for us, given the history that we come from, I remind everybody again, we've had a history of institutionalized racism. No matter what politicians say, history speaks for itself. Yes. It's not about deferring interpretations of the Constitution. Our history speaks for itself. So, to the Honorable Biman Prasad, who was saying that, they're deferring constitutional interpretations, blah, blah, may I just remind him that the NFP gave a very longish submission to the Reeves Commission. What was that all about? Why did we even have the 1997 Constitution? Right? This is an acknowledgement, and a very explicit acknowledgement, that we've had a history of institutionalized racism. There's a problem in this country. Right? Now, the issue is, how do we evacuate ourselves, right, from the vicissitudes of racism, given the fact that it is very, very natural for people to think along racial lines? Race is an important category of, sort of signify, it's an identifier for people. How do you then evacuate ourselves from racism and talk to each other across our differences? That's the biggest challenge, right? Without vilifying and degenerating discussions into personal attacks and all of that. So the first thing, and I go around doing human rights campaign with communities and all of that. I've said to young people, I said, each time you encounter a racist or any other form of hate speech, you put a stop to it there and then. Right to say this needs to stop. But what I'm asking Fiji to do now is to follow suit and report the matter to the police. The more people do it, the better it is.
This is if you see any insightful comments. Or
any insightful comment, because speech. You know why? This is the problem with Fiji too. We are always spectators. We always like to be bystanders. We want to watch stuff from the side, record, make fun of, for our own entertainment. We lose lives because of that.
Yes.
We have to stop the culture of, bullying on the cyber media, in cyberspace. We need to stop, the rampant sort of, suicides and depression, because we are pushing people to the margins, right? So when you look at hate speeches, it's not just based on race and religion. There's so much misogyny. Remember that poor child? Too, remember the poor child who was caught in the production of a particular video that was indecent and so on and so forth. I mean, she was put on trial by the social media. And people said some of the most vile, misogynist stuff. We quickly forgot that she's a child, right? We quickly forgot that we are attacking, females, as a collectivity and blah, blah. Nobody's looking at these things. So I think the first thing we need to realize is that, look, we need to stop this on the social media, and we need to point it out each time we see it. And I want human rights defenders and the self-anointed human rights defenders, and we have thousands of them in Fiji. They keep, sort of proliferating. They need to stand up to this thing, because they're very, very quiet, right? Their silence is quite telling, I think, in terms of how strategic we are about what human rights concerns we want to talk about and which ones we want to gloss. Two, report the matter to the authorities, because there is an ample provision in the Crimes Act. And remember, the law says in any form, expression in any form. So don't let the question of modality in terms of, it's a social media platform, so therefore we can't do anything about it.
You can, right?
You can. So if people are being bullied, I mean, we have a huge problem in this country about bullying in the social media, from children all the way to adults, right? So, I mean, if you look at hate speeches, you'd think that these are, sort of politically sort of, minded sort of, the old guard and all of that. You see young people in it too. And so, I mean, this whole talk about sort of like active citizenry, sort of democratic participation, people taking to the social media to sort of kind of, push ideas of democracy and all of that. It just, is thrown in our face by the fact that if you look at what they actually talk about and the way it constitutes an anathema to democratic ideals, I mean, it should make us pause and reflect. And the thing about hate speeches and all of that is that it's intergenerational. So you are talking about, the eldest in the community to the youngest. Everybody is in it.
Let's talk about legislation prohibiting hate speech. Germany has passed a law, right? That if anyone writes or some related to hate speech or racist comment, if someone posts it or even someone likes it, will be taken to task. They'll be charged. And there are other countries who followed the suit. So what can be done in Fiji?
We need a separate legislation on the question of hate speeches. I think that's very, very important. A much more nuanced legislation, given the fact that the Constitution provides a very, very important sort of, legislative, platform. The other thing is that when we do that, we must carefully balance, and I want to just do this for the sake of, select opposition political parties, because otherwise they'll flatten this otherwise very, very complicated conversation into a simple thing about Raj is muzzling freedom of expression. It's getting very, very boring to say that we need to balance our commitment in jealously guarding freedom of expression with the kind of regulatory framework we put into place, because it should not be one over the other. So a legislation must look at, for instance, what constitutes hate speech. What are the tests put into place? What kind of penal liabilities would be placed? And would the penal liabilities be so extreme that it is going to produce a chilling effect? What about the role of intermediaries? I mean, you look at it, social media might come out and say, hey, I'm just a host of Fiji Exposed Forum. So I have no control over what people are saying. Or I'm just a host of Coup 4.5. I have no responsibility over what people are saying. Or this other question that, look, I mean, I didn't really do it in Fiji. I live in London, and therefore I sat there and I wrote this. Or I live in America, and, I wrote this from California. And so it's got nothing to do with what happens in Fiji. Well, there are case laws now. There's one in Australia where somebody had placed, put a post in America, and whether the Australian courts could try this thing, and they did. The ruling was they did.
Fiji can, if people are being bullied or there are hate speeches, you can report to Human Rights Commission and police, and they'll be taken to task. We'll take a break, Ashwin, and after this I'd like to talk more about this, because people need to know their rights. They need to stand up against hate speeches. And of course, we'd like to know what would be MIDA's role come election 2018. Speak Your Mind with the Director for Human Rights Commission, Ashwin Raj. We're talking about effective yet responsible use of social media. Then we have Twitters, we have other things. So when we talk about laws, let's talk about how would you define freedom of speech under our Constitution. You did mention about that. What are our limitations? And what will be the penal liabilities?
Yes. And the other thing is the question of intermediaries and the culpability of intermediaries. So, for instance, I mean, if you're saying that I'm just a host of a platform, so I'm just Facebook or I'm Twitter or whatever it might be, am I culpable? It's not my responsibility. I just hosted this, sort of kind of platform. Go look for people who've actually done this stuff. No, actually, there is a certain responsibility that is bestowed on you as somebody who hosts these platforms. And so we need to think about the ways in which we need to regulate this to an extent that we think about the role of the intermediaries as well, the hosts, right? And to what extent there's culpability, and how do you hold them to account? So, I mean, this is something that it needs to be a very, very well thought out piece of legislation. And, I've read at length about what the Germans actually did. And, they did this because of their history. Remember, this is a country that emerges out of the Holocaust. You have neo-Nazis. I mean, there's a whole history there. Fiji has a history too, right?
Yes.
We have a history of institutionalized racism. So it's important that we start thinking about it. And this is why we have the Bill of Rights that we do. We have a constitution that is committed to erasing the ignominy of racism, the talk about common and equal citizenry and all of that kind of stuff. But Shami, I think there's another thing that needs to happen. We need to start a very, very vigorous campaign talking to people about how to engage on the social media. What does democracy actually mean in the deep sense, beyond the rhetoric of, casting of votes, the performative conventions of democracy in terms of just casting votes? What does democracy mean in terms of communication? And what kind of ethics should we have as you and I communicate across our differences, right? And this needs to be a conversation that needs to happen in schools, right? We are at the National Human Rights Commission, we are pushing for the embedding of human rights education into the school curriculum that is very, very consistent with the recommendations of the Special Rapporteur on Education, but also the UN Special Rapporteur on racism and xenophobia and all of that. So I think when we do that, we need to grapple with this thing. The other thing I think that needs to happen is the citizens need to become more vigilant. As we approach the national elections, we need to watch the tone of political rhetoric, of the interventions. People need to be able to carefully and closely scrutinize, public gatherings, what kind of utterances are being made, the manifestos, so on and so forth. Now, again, may I just remind everybody, because we have suffered from social amnesia time and time again, I'm not saying you don't be critical as far as political issues are concerned.
You should be able to discern a person's
absolutely,
motive, right?
You have every right to political expression. What I'm talking about is hate speeches.
Yes.
Right? So let's be very, very specific. That's a very, very clear caveat. So look at manifestos, you look at campaigns, you look at rallies and what people are saying. And if you think that a material is actually prejudicial and discriminatory based on a prohibited ground of discrimination, report the matter.
Report the matter. And I think it will be like I talked about trying to discern a person's motive. Right? Of course, democracy is there. And what we're writing is very important. No one in Fiji has stopped anyone's democratic right. I mean, we at FBC are always targeted. If Fiji Broadcasting is not allowing its journalists, or that we don't have democracy, which is a lie, because we want to do very fair reporting, like as we talk here today, whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that when you do go to these political rallies, right, as a concerned citizen of Fiji, and to add on, be mindful of what people are saying. If someone is trying to incite hate speech, hate towards a particular race, then think about it. Would you want to vote someone in Fiji of such character, of such thought? What kind of consequences Fiji will face? Would I want to push a party or someone in leadership who has got such mentality, inciting comments, and we have suffered,
absolutely,
suffered
and at
a lot.
what cost?
At what cost?
The real question that everybody needs to ask in Fiji is, what kind of Fiji do we want to live in?
Absolutely, yeah.
Do we want to be in the past, right, and burn in the fires of communalism and racism, or do we want to move forward and build a Fiji which is strong, which has got a strong ethic of talking to each other across differences, no matter how difficult and ugly the issue might be, and it makes us uncomfortable from any kind of issue, whether it be around land, whether it be around institutions that are integral to Itoke community, whether it be about religious freedom, any of the issues, no matter how ugly and uncomfortable that might be, can we do that in lawful ways?
Absolutely.
And through lawful means, right?
Now, to my point, Ashwin, how will your role with the Human Rights Commission affect or change during election in light of current trend we have on social media with hate speeches and all that? What will you?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you look at the Electoral Act, I mean, even in the last elections, MIDA played a fundamental role together with the Fijian Elections Office in making sure that we all observe the blackout period, right? That's the 48 hours that the public has to themselves, absent of any campaign and all of that, so that they can make their minds independently without any sort of coercion and so on and so forth. That's something that we'll be doing to make sure that the public is free to make up their minds, but we'll keep an eye on the language and the tone and whether it's inflammatory or not. This is why I think we need to have a very, very honest, robust discussions about why we call something a hate speech. If you think that there is legal ambiguity, if you think that these are concoctions of the director himself, please read the Constitution, read our laws, and map it against what is actually being said. I think, and you used a very, very beautiful word earlier, discernment. The citizens of this country can discern. We all know when something is hate speech. So let's not pretend otherwise.
We have to engage our mind and not leave our minds behind.
The reason why I didn't bring out any of those and read any of them here is because I don't want to give them any more credence. They don't belong anywhere in a space like this. I don't want to give them any more space, time, or privilege than they actually do. But I think the public is a discerning public. They
Yes,
know when
yes.
their race is being,
Yes.
that a particular race is being attacked. An attack is based on religious orientation, or on one's sexual orientation, or one's gender, and so on and so forth.
So, Ashwin, my last comment would be, as we build up towards the 2018 elections and as we step into 2018, we want a social media page where people have healthy debates,
Yes.
right? Would the Human Rights Commission do anything and be very alert or come up with laws before elections come to actually curb this kind of hate speeches? on
Well,
social media?
I mean, as you know, I lodged a complaint on my own volition, and I want to encourage more people to stand up, to report these things. Remember, if we look the other way and say, this is not my fight, wait till the day they come to get you, and it'll be a little too late. So don't wait for, the country to descend into that kind of communal, racist, divisive sort of kind of politics. Take it on now. Become, active citizens who want to build Fiji, a bright Fiji. Fiji is punching above its weight. We've done well in so many areas.
Yes.
Let's build on that. The other thing is, I think, glimpse of hope in this miasma of despair is that we in Fiji also have enormous capacity to love each other across differences.
Yes.
I've
We'll call
seen
the
that
friendly
too.
Fijians too.
I've seen that too.
Yes.
So I think a number of people from various communities need to come forward and say, look, I'm not my stereotype. I'm more than that, right? So I'm not just a curry muncher, right? I'm more than that. I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. And I think the more we dispel stereotypes, the stereotypes about Muslims and terrorism and all of that, those things need to be disentangled.
Right.
Right? The thing about ethokes and a whole bunch of stereotypes that come with them, it needs to be deconstructed. I think people need to come out and say, I'm more than my stereotype, and reach across to each other. We've done that. We've historically proven ourselves. What we need to do now is to stop
Yes.
these elements that are trying to divide us, who are trying to build walls, between people. We need to build bridges, right? We need to engage. And one thing I want to say to everybody is, if you don't agree with the system, change it.
Change it.
But
Thank
change
you.
it through lawful means.
Yes, lawful media. Thank you, Ashwin, for some very strong comments and great comments. I really appreciate you coming on this show.
Thank you.
And on closing out, to say, social media has its bad sides and good sides too. There are people who defame character. Stop assassinating someone's character. There are only a handful of people who are doing this. Don't join, don't tag along with them. You're a responsible person, be a
Yes.
responsible citizen, discern their motives and make your own judgment on that. Thank you, Ashwin, and we'd like to have you on the show some other time.
Thank you very much. And
Yeah.
thank you, Fiji, for listening. I appreciate your support.
And we wish you a very Merry Christmas.
Yes, Happy
And,
Christmas.
Yes, Happy Christmas, and we'll see you next year on Speak Your Mind.
Thank you.